Hello, I would like to explain cadences, phrases, periods, and sentences. So, cadences as well as small forms. Why do I discuss cadences in the context of small forms? Because the phrase is probably the most important small formal element of a piece of music, and usually a phrase is ended with a cadence. So let's review cadence types first. Now I'm showing you here some pages from the Kostka-Payne Almond Tonal Harmony textbook, which is a fantastic book, and I know most of you use that. So you can look it up in there. There are some really nice examples in there. Here is an example of a perfect authentic cadence. The perfect authentic cadence is the strongest kind of cadence, and it is characterized by a root position 5 chord resolving to a root position 1 chord. And that can happen here, it is in minor, but it can happen in both major and minor keys. So it's not only both are in root position, but also that the final 1 chord has the first scale degree or the tonic in the soprano. So it has it in the bass as well as in the soprano, right? Root position 5 chord to root position 1, and the 1 chord has the first scale degree in the soprano. If a dominant functioning chord resolves to 1, but these conditions or one of these conditions are not met, then it's an imperfect authentic cadence. There are several subtypes. For example, the chords could be in root position 5 to 1, but the soprano does not have the tonic. The soprano does not have the tonic. It could be an inverted imperfect authentic cadence where either the 5 chord or the 1 chord is inverted. And of course, we can have a leading tone cadence, so where Roman 7, 7 diminished 6, or 7, 7 resolves to 1 instead of 5 to 1. Now, this is an example of a deceptive cadence. That's another type. A deceptive cadence is a resolution of a dominant chord to a chord other than the tonic. The most common one, of course, is to go to Roman 6, so 5 going to Roman 6. If that happens at a cadence point, we call it a deceptive cadence. If it happens within the phrase, so that means if it's not part of a cadence, we just call it a deceptive resolution. Here's an example of a half cadence. A half cadence is essentially any chord going to 5 and ending the phrase with the dominant chord. So it is a half cadence. Here is another example of a half cadence in a minor key. One doesn't really have to come before 5. It could be other chords, but the phrase must end on 5 to be called a half cadence. There's also another special type of half cadence. It's called a Phrygian half cadence, and the Phrygian half cadence is characterized by a first inversion 4 chord going to a 5 chord, but it happens only in minor. That means if the Roman 4, the subdominant chord, is a minor triad. So normally you have the lowered 6th scale degree in a minor key, and the lowered 6th scale degree happens to be the third of the subdominant chord of this 4 chord. And if that is the lowest sounding note, like the B flat here in the key of D, the lowered 6th scale degree, and you have this half step motion in the bass from the lowered 6th scale degree down to the 5th scale degree. So because the 5 chord has the 5th scale degree in the bass. So whenever we're in a minor key and you have a minor 4/6 chord going to 5, that's called a Phrygian half cadence. Of course, there's also a plagal cadence, also called an Almond Cadence. And here's an example of it, a 4 chord going to a 1 chord. So it's called Almond Cadence because very often um, it occurs at Christian hymns at the Amen or the Amen. And as you can see, if it happens in a hymn, usually there is an authentic cadence, very often a perfect authentic cadence first, followed by the plagal cadence. But we do find it occasionally in settings other than church music, so we find it in some other art music as well, occasionally, but not as frequent. Just a quick word about harmonic rhythm. The most important aspect of the harmonic rhythm is that the resolution to one chord, if we have an authentic cadence, it falls on a strong beat. In 4/4, that could also be beat 3, but most commonly it's beat 1. And if there is a cadential 6/4 chord going to 5, then the cadential 6/4 chord usually falls on a strong beat as well. So beat 3 or beat 1. In 3/4 meter, it falls most often on beat 1, but it can occasionally fall on beat 2. So generally speaking, the cadential 6/4 chord falls on a strong beat, followed by the dominant, and then the resolution of the dominant to the tonic, also on a strong beat. Okay, so let's talk about small forms. I already mentioned phrase. So a phrase is a musical idea. In classical music, very often it's 4 measures long, even in earlier romantic music, like in this particular case. So here we have a Schubert song. We have these 4 measures, so with the pickup, and this one happened to end on a half cadence. Then there are another 4 measures, and we have a perfect authentic cadence. We can schematize this as follows. So we have 2 phrases. Phrase A, in this case, ends on a half cadence, and A prime ends on a perfect authentic cadence. Why is it A prime? Because the melody of the second phrase is similar to the melody of the first case. Just the ending is slightly different. It's also possible to have A and A unmodified, except that usually that then has the same kind of cadence, and that means it's a phrase group and not a period. But if the 2 phrases have cadences that increase in strength, like the half cadence is a weak cadence, the perfect authentic cadence is the strongest kind of cadence. So if the strength of the cadence increases from one phrase to the next, and especially when the phrases melodically are similar, then they create what we call a period. And it's parallel if they're similar, or we call it contrasting if they're melodically dissimilar. Here we have an example of a Beethoven Sonata. We have phrase 1 ending on a half cadence, phrase 2 ending on a half cadence, phrase 3 ending on a half cadence, and phrase 4 ending on a perfect authentic cadence. So we can call the first 2 phrases the antecedent. And if we looked at the melody, then the melodic material was different, so it's A and B. And the last 2 phrases we call the consequent, so antecedent, consequent, and it's also A and B prime, so a modified B. And here we have the increase of strength of the cadence, both within the consequent, but also from the end of the antecedent, from this half cadence to the end of the consequent. So in this case, it creates a parallel double period. Some music theorists would not consider this instance of the first of this antecedent here, period, because the strength of the cadence does not increase. Both are half cadences, but other music theorists do call this a period. So 2 periods creating a double period. The sentence is a special case of a phrase that is characterized by having a melodic idea that is immediately repeated, or repeated in a slightly modified way, like x and x prime, and then a motion toward a cadence, so any kind of cadence you can have. So that's the schema of a sentence. So for example, here in this Mozart example, you have the melodic idea. The melodic idea very slightly modified, only the last note is different. So x and x prime, and then the motion toward the cadence. And in this case, the cadence comes here as a half cadence. So a very important type of a phrase, the sentence. We find it very frequently in classical music and romantic music as well. So that was the review of cadences and small forms, phrases, periods, double periods, and sentences.